Hey everybody, my name is Rieke and I'm here with Vincent Southerland, Dan Svirsky, and Mingwei. And we're going to talk about our paper, Imperfect Inferences, Practical Assessment. By way of introduction, we wrote this paper because there's been a lot of debate in this community, at tech companies, among regulators in Washington, D.C., about the right way to use demographic data, particularly inferences about people's demographics, to do measurement and hopefully intervention when it comes to racial and other kinds of discrimination. This is not something that's just theoretical in a fact context. This is something that civil rights organizations have been calling for. This is something that many large tech companies are actively working on. For example, Airbnb announced a couple of years ago that they were going to start doing anti-discrimination work based on inferred racial information. Meta, previously Facebook, recently announced that it's going to start inferring demographic and racial characteristics about its users to do measurement in the United States. And Uber and LinkedIn in various dimensions have done work as well. This all sits against a backdrop of a lot of concern. Some of that concern just pertains to inaccuracy. Are racial or other kinds of inferences good enough to actually be useful and not harmful as a measurement tool at all? Some of this relates to critiques of race and other demographic categories as valid social constructs, or around human rights, privacy, or other dimensions of this issue. So that's kind of the background. And our goal with this paper, as Dan will talk more about in a moment, is to ask the question of, are common racial inference methods good enough? Are they useful to be used as measurement tools in corporate and other settings? And the analysis we'll talk about in a moment gives you a snapshot of what we found. So before we get there, I want to pass things over to Ming to talk a little bit about some of the prior art in this space that we're building on. Ming?
So some prior research on this, quantitative researchers have done a lot of analysis on the accuracy of racial inference methods. And these studies point to the possibilities of these methods both underestimating and overestimating demographic disparities, depending on how these inferences are applied.
Great, thanks, Ming. So I want to just return to something really quickly that Aaron talked about at the outset, really quickly, which is acknowledging that race itself is a social construct. It is not a biological or fixed category. There is no gene or cluster of genes common to a particular racial group, but instead is a performative identity, and one that really shifts over time in context across interactions. Notwithstanding the fact that race is a socially constructed phenomenon, it does have real meaning, and it does shape our experiences as we move through the world. It has this enduring endemic quality. It touches every aspect of the world around us, and it serves as a marker of inequality and unfairness across an infinite number of domains. The fact that race is a social construct and has meaning and shift over time has implications for the way in which we live our lives, and produces some tensions across the paper which we grapple with. One arises when we think about the data that we might collect in order to secure some information about one's identity, where the prompt for collecting that data asks about one's race/ethnicity. Generally speaking, race refers to the socially constructed categories, while ethnicity refers to a person's culture. Another comes up when we think of individuals who may identify with multiple races or multiple racial categories. We generally try and deal with those tensions in this paper by referencing race alone. We don't examine people who fall into more than one racial category, nor do we examine the intersection of race and gender, although we understand those are important, critically important areas for further exploration. We largely treat a person's self-reported race as a fixed feature, even though we understand that one's definitions can change under time. And quite frankly, that's just necessary for us to undergo this really, really critically important research. I'll turn it over to Dan so we can take it from there.
Great. So where we stand right now, given what Aaron, Ming, and Vincent were saying, is that there's increasingly seen a need to be able to test for disparities. But there are challenges that Ming pointed out with the empirics. There are challenges that Vincent pointed out with the definition. So where does that leave us? We wanted to contribute to this conversation by using some data that allows us to explore how accurate inferences are and best practices around using them. So what we have is from 2019, there is a group of Uber users who opted into sharing their self-reported demographic for research purposes. And what this lets us do is it lets us look at how the inference methods compare to the self-reported demographics. And it also lets us look at different outcomes for this group of people who happen to be surveyed, and whether the inferences kind of give us similar answers as the self-reported demographics for outcomes of interest. So moving to the next slide, I want to start with just some summary statistics of these users. So there are about 12,000 of them from 2019. So it's a self-selected sample. It's a small sample relative to the group as a whole, but already we're kind of seeing some of the patterns that Vincent mentioned, which is that even though race is a social construct, it does pop up in a lot of ways. So with this graph, what this table looks at is different outcomes by self-reported demographic groups. And the outcomes we pull are some from publicly available data sets, some from internal Uber data sets about outcomes on the platform or behaviors on the platform. And there are differences. I mean, what we see here is that Uber and all of us we have to take the world as given that the vestiges of race really are everywhere. So looking down 5 rows, for instance, looking at the proportion of trips that a user took in 2019 in a historically redlined neighborhood, we see that African-American users, they're about 11% of their trips were in these neighborhoods versus 10% of users as a whole, a statistically significant difference. And I think what's striking about this is that redlining refers to a policy that's almost 100 years old about mortgage financing. And so the fact that 100 years later, we could still see some of the vestiges of this policy in the data shows that race is something that lives on and that we can't ignore. So again, a lot of these outcomes, be it Uber or external outcomes, we see differences by self-reported demographic groups. The next question, though, is whether inferred demographics work for the purposes that we want to use them. So are they accurate is kind of the first question. So what this figure looks at compares on the left side self-reported demographic groups, and on the right side how they get categorized by one of the 4 inference methods we tested. This is an inference method that uses people's name, the order of letters in their name, to predict their demographics, trained on Florida voter registration data. So starting with the Asian or Asian American group on the left in blue. So among self-reported Asian or Asian American users, most get correctly classified by the inference method as Asian or Asian American. When it makes a mistake, it tends to misclassify them as white. The same is true for Latinx users. For the most part, they're inferred correctly. When there's a mistake, it miscategorizes them as white when they would self-report that they are not. Going down to white and African-American users, the most common mistake we see when this method infers based on name is that a slight majority of self-reported African-American users get miscategorized as white. And so this is, what this suggests is that there are real limits and inaccuracies in these inference methods. The next slide shows the same figure, but for all 4 inference methods that we use. I encourage you to go to the paper for a more detailed description of the different inference methods. But the key takeaway is that they all make mistakes. They make different types of mistakes in some cases, but just none of them are perfect. So the question is, we know they're imperfect, but are they still useful? Can they still be used for the purposes that we want them? Because it's not enough to know whether an inference is inaccurate. What we really care about is, supposing there's a disparity among self-reported demographic users, if we have to rely on inferred demographics, would we still detect that disparity? Or would using the inference fool us into thinking there's no disparity when there actually is one, or vice versa? And that's what the next couple slides turn to. By and large, the answer is, even though the inference methods are imperfect, they roughly work. So for example, here, the bar graphs on the left show how many trips in 2019 among this sample of users were in neighborhoods with a high density of restaurants. And what we can see on the left, looking at the 2 bars all the way to the left, are that among self-reported white and African-American users, white users had slightly more trips in areas with a high density of restaurants. So about 6% versus 4% of trips. Now, what happens if we rely on inferences instead of self-reports? Roughly, we get the right directional answer. So if we rely on any of the 4 inference methods we tested, we recover this underlying difference among self-reported white and African-American users. The graph on the right shows a little bit more detail with error bars. Again, just showing that looking at African-American users proportion minus white users, we see a slight negative value for among self-reported users, and we recover that slight negative value with all 4 inference methods. We can conduct this exercise with a host of different outcomes, all the outcomes we showed on the previous table, and roughly find that this result holds, that the inference methods typically show you directionally what's happening. And if you broaden what you do and use several inference methods, you're generally going to get the right answer. And that's kind of the best practice approach if you're trying to understand what's happening among self-reported demographics. Going to the next slide. This looks at pollution levels by pickup location. It's kind of a sad graph, to be honest. It's sad data in the sense that it shows higher pollution levels in where African-American users in this sample took Uber trips. But from a data standpoint, what's interesting about it is, again, it shows that if you have to rely on inferences, they're generally going to give you the right directional answer compared to self-reported demographics. But also what it illustrates, we suspect, is that the type of inference you use should track the underlying disparity and can in some cases tell you something about the underlying disparity. What we mean by that is looking at the categories of inferences. Some of them rely just on name, like ethnic color and NAMSOR, whereas others rely on geography, like trips, or a mix of name and geography. And what we find here is that the ones that incorporate geography data are slightly better at recovering the underlying disparity in pollution levels. And the reason we think that's happening is that this is a difference across self-reported users that is geographic in nature. It's less about how someone presents as one of the 4 categories in terms of name or appearance or language, and more about where people are located. And so an inference that relies on where people are located may do a better job because the underlying difference is geographic in nature. Similarly, you could imagine situations where there's an underlying disparity that has to do with people's name or appearance. And in those cases, an inference that relies on name or appearance might do a better job than one based on geography. So what this suggests to us is that in addition to using a bunch of different inference methods to try to understand the situation, you need to be thoughtful about what you think the underlying disparity is and use that to inform the type of analysis you're doing. So with that, I will hand it back to Aaron to tie things up.
Great. Appreciate everyone who's watching this for giving us your time today. Just want to end with a few kind of final points to wrap us up. I mean, and the first is, right, what does this paper stand for? This paper really stands for the proposition that yes, these are hard questions. Yes, these inference methods are imperfect and inaccurate, but nonetheless, what we don't want is people out in the world to throw up their hands, right? These are hard problems. These are problems where we have imperfect tools, but we think that the analysis that we've done in this paper really shows that there's directional value in spotting disparities. I also want to emphasize that we're really focused on measurement, and that's intentional. The reason we focus on measurement is because if you can't do good measurement, any intervention you might want to do isn't going to work either, right? And so we're really careful to focus on measurement because that's the foundation, right? We also want to emphasize that once you've spotted a disparity, we're not necessarily saying the way to fix that is a machine learning or fairness intervention in the technology itself, right? When you see an intervention, that should lead to a really holistic, inclusive discussion at a company or other kind of entity about what to do about that. And then, as Dan said, you know, there's never going to be a single idealized method for doing racial or other kinds of demographic inferences. I think that there's a toolbox out there, and we should be thinking creatively about what individual tools or combination of inference tools make sense for a different context. So with that, we are done for today. Please reach out to any of us if there's any more desire for conversations or questions on this issue. We put this paper out there because we think this is a discussion that needs to be continued.